There was a time in human history when hunting wasn't just about survival. It was about power. It was about declaring ownership over death itself. Kings didn't hunt because they were hungry. They hunted because the act of hunting was the truest expression of absolute authority, the right to decide which creature lived and which creature died. And now, in the modern age, we've criminalized nearly every ancient hunting technique that built empires, that fed dynasties, that kept bloodlines in power for centuries. But here's what historians won't tell you. The laws that banned these methods weren't created to protect wildlife. They were created to strip ordinary people of the very tools that once made them equals to the ruling class. Let me take you back to Rome. Around 100 AD, the imperial courts organized what they called venationes, organized hunts where hundreds of animals were slaughtered in a single day for public entertainment. These weren't casual hunts. These were military operations. The hunters used techniques so advanced, so ruthlessly efficient, that a small group of skilled men could trap and kill enough game to feed thousands. Pit traps disguised with vegetation, coordinated drive hunts using trained dogs and horns to force entire herds into kill zones. They used poisons derived from plants, monkshood, hemlock, wolfsbane, substances so potent that a single scratch could kill a full-grown elk. These techniques were the reason Rome could sustain its massive military and urban population. They were the reason an empire could control an entire continent. But the real power wasn't in the weapons. The real power was in the knowledge. Roman hunters passed down trade secrets across generations, ways to read animal behavior, ways to predict migration patterns, ways to move through wilderness so silently that prey didn't even know death was approaching. This wasn't just hunting technique. This was a form of military intelligence gathering, and it was available to common people. Any man with patience and cunning could master these skills. Any man could become dangerous. Any man could threaten the established order. By the Middle Ages, European nobility understood this threat perfectly. They saw how hunting knowledge could destabilize their grip on power. So they created something insidious, the game laws. The Norman conquest of England in 1066 introduced the first sweeping restrictions on who could hunt what, where, and when. William the Conqueror declared entire forests as royal preserves. Poaching became a capital crime. A peasant caught hunting a stag in the king's forest could lose their hand, could lose their life, could watch their family starved as punishment. These weren't environmental protections. They were weapons of social control. They were designed specifically to keep the majority of the population dependent on the nobility for meat, for clothing, for survival itself. And here's what's crucial to understand. The nobility didn't actually care about the animals. They cared about monopolizing the knowledge of how to survive independently. A man who could hunt invisibly, who could navigate wilderness, who could feed himself without permission from a lord, that man was a threat. That man had agency. That man could rebel. So the game laws systematized the erasure of hunting knowledge. Generations of people were deliberately kept ignorant of techniques that their ancestors had mastered. The knowledge was suppressed so thoroughly that by the 17th century, most common people had completely forgotten how to hunt using anything other than firearms, which, conveniently, the nobility could regulate and control. The techniques that were banned, and here's the pattern you need to see, were always the ones that worked best, without authority or expensive equipment. Pit traps required only understanding of terrain and animal behavior. Poisoning required knowledge of plants, not money. Drive hunts required community cooperation, not submission to hierarchy. The bow hunting techniques that took years to master could be practiced by anyone with access to wood and string. Trapping techniques using knots and cordage cost nothing. Net hunting, snare setting, deadfall construction, all of these were methodologies that gave power to the powerless, so they were criminalized. One by one, jurisdiction by jurisdiction, they were outlawed. Now jump forward to the American frontier. The early colonies had different game laws than Europe, but the underlying principle remained identical. Indigenous peoples had perfected hunting techniques over thousands of years, methods that were sustainable, that were integrated with nature, that worked in perfect balance with animal populations. They used controlled burning to manage forests and drive game. They used weirs to catch fish. They used blowguns with poison darts with such precision that they could harvest exactly what they needed without destroying ecosystems. They understood predator patterns. They knew which plants attracted which animals. They had created a complete system of knowledge that made them completely self-sufficient. And when European colonists arrived, one of their primary strategies wasn't just to steal land. It was to criminalize indigenous hunting techniques. The colonists passed laws that specifically prohibited the hunting methods indigenous peoples had used for millennia. Fire hunting became illegal. Communal hunts were restricted. The very act of hunting on certain lands without permission from the colonial authorities became a crime. And conveniently, the new authorities, the colonists, the settlers, the representatives of distant kings, established hunting seasons and regulations that prevented indigenous peoples from harvesting game during the times when they traditionally did so. It was genius from the perspective of control. Instead of banning the indigenous peoples directly, they banned their hunting techniques. Instead of saying, "You cannot hunt," they said, "You cannot use fire. You cannot hunt communally. You cannot hunt in winter. You cannot use poisons." The result was the same. Indigenous peoples lost access to their primary food source. They became dependent on trade, on government rations, on the colonial system. Their hunting knowledge, accumulated over thousands of years, became worthless overnight. But the colonists faced a problem. Their own settlers, poor European immigrants, indentured servants, people at the absolute bottom of the social hierarchy, had access to the same wilderness knowledge. The knowledge couldn't be completely erased because it was embedded in the environment itself. So the colonists adapted the strategy. They created property laws. They created exclusive hunting rights. They created seasons and licenses. They created the concept of game as something owned by the state rather than freely available to those who could capture it. Suddenly, hunting wasn't an act of survival or skill. It was a regulated privilege. A man needed permission. A man needed to pay. And if a man hunted without that permission, using those old techniques that his ancestors had used, he was a criminal. Here's where it gets darker. By the 1700s and 1800s, a new class of wealthy industrialists and capitalists had emerged in America. They had made fortunes in mining, railroads, manufacturing. And these men, these new aristocrats, wanted hunting to be a status symbol. They wanted it to be expensive. They wanted it to be exclusive. So they lobbied for state hunting laws specifically designed to criminalize poor people's hunting while preserving hunting opportunities for the wealthy. The wealthy could afford licenses. The wealthy could afford to travel to private hunting reserves. The wealthy could afford firearms, ammunition, horses, guides. Poor people couldn't. So the laws that were passed, ostensibly about conservation, were actually about class warfare. The bans on specific hunting techniques had nothing to do with sustainability. They had everything to do with ensuring that only the wealthy could hunt, and only using methods that required money and infrastructure to execute. Look at the specific techniques that were banned. In nearly 40 states today, you cannot use pit traps, deadfalls, or snares for hunting large game. Why? Because these methods are so efficient that a man with nothing but knowledge could feed his family year-round. You cannot use poison, even though indigenous peoples used it sustainably for thousands of years. Why? Because poison doesn't require expensive firearms or ammunition. You cannot use drive hunts to herd game into kill zones. Why? Because drive hunts require community cooperation and traditional knowledge that can't be monitored or licensed. You cannot use controlled fire to manage forests and improve habitat. Why? Because fire management was how indigenous peoples shaped entire landscapes. And that's a power the state wants to monopolize. You cannot use dogs in certain ways. You cannot use specific call techniques. You cannot hunt at night. You cannot hunt during certain seasons. Each restriction has an official justification: conservation, wildlife management, preventing overhunting. But if you look at the actual data, the actual science, the restrictions don't correlate with population health at all. States with the most restrictive hunting laws don't have healthier animal populations. States with the least restrictive laws don't have depleted populations. Many states have overpopulation problems. 2. Populations in the Northeast have exploded to the point where they're destroying entire forests. Elk populations in the West are so abundant that they're causing ecological damage. Feral pig populations have become an invasive nightmare. The state's response? They don't relax the restrictions. They don't acknowledge that traditional hunting techniques might actually help manage these populations. They do the opposite. They further restrict what people can do. while spending hundreds of millions of dollars on state-run hunting and management programs that benefit wealthy outfitters and hunting lodges. The hypocrisy goes deeper. States allow wealthy landowners to conduct their own management hunts on private property without the same restrictions. A wealthy man can hire professional hunters to conduct drive hunts on his land. He can use all the techniques that are illegal for ordinary people. He can create private hunting reserves where conservation supposedly happens while maintaining the most exclusive experience money can buy. Meanwhile, a poor man in the same state cannot use the most basic survival techniques on public lands. That man is told he's breaking the law. That man faces fines, imprisonment, loss of hunting privileges, and the hypocrisy is so normalized that most people don't even see it. Now here's what you need to understand about why this matters today. The criminalization of traditional hunting techniques is part of a much larger pattern of knowledge suppression and control. When the state bans a skill, that skill doesn't disappear. It becomes forbidden knowledge. It becomes something that only rebels, criminals, and those with no respect for authority maintain. It becomes dangerous. It becomes separated from its sustainable, responsible context. A man who learns to trap because his family is starving is no longer being taught by elders who understand ecosystem balance. He's learning from someone outside the law. The accumulated wisdom that kept these techniques sustainable for thousands of years gets lost. What remains is only the technique, divorced from the ethics and the understanding that once surrounded it. The state's official narrative is that these bans are necessary for conservation, but the real motivation, the historical motivation that persists today, is control. The state wants to be the only entity that decides how wildlife is managed. The state wants hunting to be something that requires permission, requires payment, requires submission to bureaucratic authority. The state wants to maintain a monopoly on the knowledge and practice of taking food from nature without intermediaries. And most critically, the state wants to ensure that citizens remain dependent on industrial food systems, on supply chains, on money and permission. If you wanted to truly destabilize modern control systems, if you wanted genuine independence, you would relearn these banned techniques. You would understand animal behavior again. You would know which plants kill and which plants heal. You would remember how to move through wilderness without permission. You would understand how to work with communities to manage resources sustainably. You would know how to feed yourself when supply chains break. You would possess the one thing that makes people truly dangerous to those in power: self-sufficiency. And that's exactly why every prohibition exists. That's exactly why these techniques are illegal. Not because they don't work, not because they harm wildlife, but because they work too well. Because they give power back to individuals. The 40 states that have criminalized these traditional hunting methods are participating in a centuries-old project of keeping ordinary people dependent and controllable. And the language has changed. The laws are now framed in terms of conservation, wildlife management, public safety. But the underlying goal remains exactly what it was in medieval Europe, what it was in colonial America: ensuring that the knowledge of true independence remains locked away, forbidden, dangerous, and therefore inaccessible to most people. If you want to understand how power actually works in society, you need to understand that the most effective form of control isn't violence, it's knowledge suppression. It's not prohibiting an action directly, it's prohibiting the techniques that make independence possible. It's fragmenting accumulated wisdom into isolated, criminalized practices that lose their context and their power. And these hunting laws are just one visible expression of a much deeper pattern that controls every aspect of modern life. I've gone much deeper into this connection and the specific legal history in the pinned comment and the description, resources that document exactly how these restrictions evolved and what they were really designed to do. But here's what most people don't realize. Those hunting restrictions didn't emerge from nowhere. They were engineered, methodically. And understanding their true origin story reveals something far more disturbing about how modern civilization actually operates, and what we've all collectively lost in the process. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, as industrialization exploded across Europe and America, the ruling class faced a critical problem. The working poor, laborers, farmers, indigenous peoples, still possessed practical knowledge that made them dangerously self-sufficient. They could hunt, they could trap, they understood plants, they could source their own food, build their own shelter, and live independently if they chose to. This terrified the emerging industrial power structure, because self-sufficient people are harder to control. They're less dependent on wages, less vulnerable to manipulation through scarcity, less likely to accept brutal working conditions when they know they could survive on their own terms. So the solution was elegant in its ruthlessness: criminalize the skills themselves. Fragment the knowledge, make independence illegal. They couldn't directly ban being self-sufficient, that would trigger rebellion, but they could ban the specific techniques one by one, wrapped in the language of conservation and wildlife protection, noble sounding, difficult to argue against publicly, and completely effective at severing the knowledge chain between generations. Take snaring, for instance. Snares have been used across virtually every culture for thousands of years. A simple technique: understanding animal behavior, reading signs, setting a device that requires minimal intervention. It's efficient. It works, which is exactly why it was criminalized so aggressively. The laws against snaring didn't come from wildlife concern. They came from a need to prevent people from accessing protein sources independently. The same applies to trapping, to certain hunting methods, to even gathering certain plants. What makes this darker is how the suppression was layered. First, the laws. Then, the education system was reformed to ensure that these practical skills were never taught in schools. Children were steered away from outdoor self-sufficiency toward wage labor preparation. Simultaneously, the cultural narrative shifted. Hunting became positioned as a sport for the wealthy elite, with licenses, seasons, and regulated bag limits, rather than what it actually was for most of human history: a survival necessity that required sophisticated knowledge passed down through families and communities. The genius of this system, and I use genius in the most sinister sense, is that it works through generations. Parents don't teach skills they've been taught are illegal. Children grow up in a knowledge vacuum, believing these skills are mysterious, dangerous, or beyond their capability. The cultural memory of competence is erased. Within 2 generations, what was once common knowledge becomes transgressive information. Within 3, it becomes incomprehensible. And this is where the hunting laws reveal their true purpose. They're not about animal conservation. Studies prove that traditional hunting methods are often more sustainable than modern industrial hunting. They're about ensuring that the modern person remains fundamentally dependent on supermarkets, dependent on jobs, dependent on the system that controls the distribution of resources. But the suppression went even deeper. Beyond just the skills themselves, the laws were designed to criminalize the act of sharing knowledge. Teaching someone to set a snare, that could be conspiracy or contributing to a crime. Demonstrating traditional hunting techniques, depending on jurisdiction, that's potentially illegal instruction. Passing down family knowledge about which plants are edible, which roots can be harvested, which hunting grounds were historically used, all of it became legally perilous. This created what historians call the knowledge prison. You're free to move, free to speak within parameters, but the specific information that would make you materially independent is locked behind legal walls, and if you try to pass it on, you become a criminal. The system doesn't just prevent you from hunting using traditional methods. It prevents you from learning them. It prevents you from teaching them. It criminalizes even the conversation about them. Look at what happened in specific states during the 1950s and 1960s. Regulatory bodies explicitly worked with law enforcement to arrest and prosecute people, disproportionately targeting rural, poor, and indigenous communities for using traditional methods their ancestors had used for centuries. The prosecutions weren't random. They targeted people in economically vulnerable regions where these skills still represented real survival alternatives. A logger who knew how to supplement his family's food through hunting? That knowledge made him a potential flight risk if exploited. An indigenous family maintaining ancestral practices? That represented cultural resistance to assimilation. The laws became enforcement tools for cultural erasure dressed up as environmental protection. And it worked. By the 1980s, in most American states, knowledge of traditional hunting and trapping had been successfully fragmented. Elders who carried it were aging. Young people had been systematically steered away from learning it. The cultural continuity was broken. The threat of self-sufficient populations had been effectively neutralized through legal, educational, and cultural pressure working in coordinated concert. Now here's where it gets truly disturbing. Once this knowledge suppression was complete and normalized, it became the template. The mechanism was proven effective. Why wouldn't you apply it elsewhere? Why wouldn't you apply it to everything? And that's exactly what happened. The same pattern: criminalize independence, suppress knowledge transmission, control through regulation, was replicated across medical knowledge, food production, construction, alternative energy, water management, and countless other domains. If you understand how the hunting law restrictions actually functioned, you understand the skeleton key to modern control systems. They don't work through direct prohibition. They work through fragmentation, criminalization of knowledge, and the weaponization of safety and protection as justifications. This is why historical understanding matters so profoundly. When you understand that hunting laws weren't created to protect animals, but to prevent human independence, you start asking deeper questions about other laws, about other restrictions, about other knowledge that's been criminalized or suppressed. You start recognizing the pattern, and once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. The suppressed hunting skills were just the most visible and understandable example of a mechanism that operates constantly throughout modern civilization. Control through knowledge fragmentation, power maintained through the criminalization of competence, safety and protection invoked as justifications for restrictions that actually serve consolidation of power. This isn't just about hunting. This mechanism has been refined over centuries. Look at medieval peasants forbidden from reading. Look at colonial authorities burning indigenous medical texts. Look at how modern governments classify ancestral farming knowledge as unregulated agriculture. The pattern is always the same. Erase the skills, criminalize the practice, offer an expensive licensed alternative, consolidate power. Hunting laws are simply the most recent, most legalized version of an ancient mechanism of control. Consider the Columbian Exchange. When Spanish conquistadors encountered the Taino people of the Caribbean, they didn't just wage military conquest. They methodically documented and then banned every single survival technique the Taino possessed: hunting methods, fishing techniques, plant cultivation strategies, all made illegal under colonial law. The stated reason? Unsustainable practices. The actual reason? Dependency. A population that can feed itself cannot be controlled. A population that must purchase food from colonial administrators can be squeezed endlessly. The modern hunting restrictions follow the exact same blueprint, just disguised in environmental language. The stated justification: species protection. The actual mechanism: making self-sufficiency illegal. When you can no longer hunt with traditional methods, you become a consumer. You buy your meat at markets. You depend on supply chains. You depend on permission. You depend on the system. And a dependent population is an obedient population. But here's what disturbs authorities most. It's not that people hunt. It's that people can think independently about hunting. That's the real threat. A person who understands plant identification, animal tracking, food preservation, water sourcing, that's a person who understands they don't need permission to survive. That's a person who might start questioning other forms of permission, other forms of restriction, other forms of control. This is exactly why the knowledge was criminalized in the first place. Not because the hunting skills themselves are dangerous. Millions of indigenous cultures sustain themselves perfectly well for millennia using these exact methods. The danger isn't the skill. The danger is the independence it represents. The danger is that once people understand they can meet their own needs, they start reconsidering every institution that claims to be necessary for survival. And this is where the psychology becomes absolutely fascinating. Governments didn't need to publicly ban all hunting skills. They just needed to criminalize the most practical ones, the ones that actually work, the ones that are actually teachable and learnable. They left legal hunting open, but only through licensed, expensive, heavily regulated, monitored channels that require you to have the correct knowledge, the knowledge provided by official sources. They didn't want to stop people from hunting. They wanted to stop people from knowing how to hunt on their own terms. The 40 states with these criminalized hunting techniques, they didn't develop these laws organically. They developed them through coordinated movements by conservation foundations, many of which receive funding from sources with vested interests in centralized food systems and resource control. The same philanthropic structures that fund population control initiatives. The same architectural of power that operates globally. And the most brilliant part of this strategy? Environmental justification actually sounds reasonable. Protecting endangered species sounds noble. Preventing overhunting sounds sensible. No one questions it because the reasoning is presented as scientifically sound, which is exactly why this mechanism works so effectively. The best control systems are the ones people accept voluntarily because they believe in the justification. This is the pattern throughout human history. Control is never presented as control. It's always presented as protection. Protection from starvation, so take the government ration. Protection from disease, so take the government medication. Protection from illegal hunting, so buy your meat from approved sources. Protection from financial instability, so accept the debt system. Protection from false information, so trust only official sources. Every restriction wrapped in the language of care. The hunting skills that are now illegal in 40 states represent something even larger than hunting itself. They represent the right to understanding, the right to competence, the right to independence. They represent humanity's capacity to know our world, to meet our own needs, to think and act without asking permission. And that right has been systematically criminalized because dependent humans are controllable humans. The reason these truths matter so profoundly isn't because you need to start snaring rabbits tomorrow. It's because understanding the mechanism changes how you see everything. When you understand that knowledge has been criminalized as a control mechanism, you start examining every restriction through that lens. You start asking which laws exist to protect you, and which exist to prevent you from protecting yourself. You start recognizing that independence is always framed as danger, and you start understanding that the most effective control system is the one you voluntarily enforce on yourself through internalized limitations. There's actually a complete breakdown of which hunting skills were criminalized in which states, and the actual historical documents showing how these laws were coordinated through conservation foundations. I've put all of that in the description and in the pinned comment below if you want to dive deeper into how this specific control mechanism operates across America. What's most important is that you understand the larger pattern. Hunting laws are just one visible manifestation of something that operates everywhere. Knowledge fragmentation, skill criminalization, dependency creation. It's the architecture of modern control, and once you see it in every restriction, in every safety requirement, in every expert recommendation. The pattern never changes, only the justification does. The forgotten hunting skills aren't truly forgotten, they're just criminalized. They're just locked behind language that makes them sound dangerous. And the moment you understand that restriction, you start recognizing the same pattern everywhere in modern life. The illusion of choice, while the actual choices are being criminalized. The appearance of freedom, while the mechanisms of independence are methodically dismantled. This is why these conversations matter. This is why understanding history matters. Not because you need to become a hunter, but because recognizing how power operates through the criminalization of knowledge is the first step toward actual freedom. Real freedom isn't just the absence of chains. It's the presence of competence. It's understanding that you have agency, that you can learn, that you can know, that you don't need permission to meet your own needs. And if you want to understand more about how knowledge has been systematically suppressed throughout history, how civilizations have used criminalization as a control mechanism, and what you can actually do about reclaiming independence, check the description and the pinned comment. There's a complete resource guide there that walks through this pattern across multiple domains of life. Thank you for descending into this darkness with me. The fact that you're here, asking these questions, seeking these truths, that already means you're refusing the most effective control mechanism of all, willful ignorance. Subscribe to Throne of Horrors. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when we uncover the next horrifying truth that civilization once buried. And like this video so others can discover what you've learned today. The darkness is always more interesting than the comfortable lie. See you in the next